Welcome to another episode of Tech Right Now, the weekly podcast of the American Conservative. I'm Andrew Day, here with my colleagues Jude Russo and Joseph Addington. Today we'll be talking about President Donald Trump's Liberation Day tariffs, the tumult in the stock market they caused, and the potential benefits they can bring. I should say now we're recording on Wednesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and it seems there's breaking news on this front. So when we get to the tariffs conversation, I'll kick it to Joseph to update me because I actually don't know what's going on with the latest breaking news. But after our tariffs talk, we'll be talking about Trump's meeting on Monday with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and relatedly, about an announcement the president made during that meeting. He said that the U.S. and Iran would hold direct talks this weekend on Iran's nuclear program. Before we dive in, I want to remind our listeners that there is a video version of this episode that you can watch on YouTube. So please subscribe to the American Conservative on YouTube, smash the like button, share with your friends, support the show. It really would mean a lot. Okay, so tariffs. I don't think I need to provide too much context. Everyone's been following the story. Last week, Wednesday, Trump announced sweeping tariffs on nearly all U.S. trade partners, a 10% global tariff, and then an additional so called reciprocal tariff that varies by country depending on their trade balance with America. On Thursday and Friday, after he made that announcement on Wednesday, the stock market crashed. This week, there's been a lot of tumult in the stock market, but so far the net effect hasn't been quite as bad as many people had feared. I mean, Joseph, right before we started recording, you told me that there is breaking news on the tariff front. So what's going on now?
Yeah, so just a few minutes ago, then President Trump posted this. He says, based on the lack of respect that China has shown to the world's markets, I am hereby raising the tariff charge to China by the United States to 125% effective immediately. At some point, hopefully in the near future, China will realize that the days of ripping off the USA and other countries is no longer sustainable or acceptable. Conversely, and based on the fact that more than 75 countries have called representatives of the United States, including the Departments of Commerce, Treasury, and the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, to negotiate a solution to the subjects being discussed relative to trade, trade barriers, tariffs, currency manipulation, and non monetary tariffs, and that these countries have not, at my strong suggestion, retaliated in any way, shape, or form against the United States, I have authorized a 90-day pause and a substantially lowered reciprocal tariff during this period of 10%, also effective immediately. Um, so it looks like the general tariff program, the universal tariff program that Trump had announced on April 2nd, is being delayed significantly for at least 90 days, and China's getting slapped with another big tranche of tariffs. And on the strength of that information, markets have gone way up. So the S&P 500 is up over 7% today. Um, Pretty much all of that in like the last 10 minutes.
Okay, I'm glad this morning that my wife and I decided not to sell our stocks. Sounds like there was some unexpected good news. So it sounds like, last week when Trump announced the tariffs on Liberation Day, my understanding is that the 10% global tariff was imposed immediately, and then the so-called reciprocal tariff was going to be imposed today, April 9th. I'm saying so-called reciprocal tariff because that actually had it wasn't just a matter of we tariff other countries what they tariff us. There was this kind of complex formula that was looking at the trade balance that every country has with the US that was kind of informing the tariff that we ended up putting on them. But it sounds like that has now been taken away. So we still have the global 10% tariff. We still have the strong tariffs on China. I guess they're even higher than I realized. When we started recording, I thought they were 104% on Chinese goods, and then China had put like 84% on American goods. And now it sounds like the American tariffs are even higher. So we're in a trade war with China, but the other reciprocal tariffs, so called, have been taken off, as I understand. I guess that applies to Europe, which also retaliated as China did. Jude, you're kind of the tariff man. You're the most pro tariff, one of the most pro tariff staffers at the American Conservative. So can you talk a bit about how you were thinking of the tariffs before today, and what's your reaction to this latest news?
Sure. Um, last time I was on, which I guess is about a month ago, we talked about the different functions that tariffs have. We talked about punitive tariffs, which are sort of negotiating tactics. We talked about actual protective tariffs, which are targeted towards defending certain American industries. And we talked about revenue tariffs. Um, I think that today's news shows that there was that a lot of the sort of initial tariffs that were announced on Liberation Day were negotiating tactics. You start a negotiation by demanding a lot, and then you generally draw back from that. So I, you know, people were losing their hair and their minds over the first tranche of tariffs that got announced on Liberation Day. I always figured there would be some amount of walk back on that. And now, with the benefit of hindsight, I can declare victory. Um, the I do think that I think that there are a couple of things worth looking at here. Um, the first is whether, even if we were to keep them in place, it would be worth trying. Um, in the discussion of tariffs, especially the discussion of the past week, with the background of market tumult, um, there's been a lot of discussion over, whether this is sort of the right move economically. Um, the tariffs are, however, addressed at a political end rather than a purely economic end. On the sort of purely economic front, the era of free trade has had a lot to recommend it. The numbers have gone up. The United States has a very comfortable consumer society with a very high standard of living. Um, if you're working from purely economic premises, there's no reason not to sort of keep on trucking with things as they have been. Um, the tariffs, however, have a political goal, which is there are certain political ends that are not served by the free trade era. We do not have control of certain strategic industries. Uh, if you are sort of more oriented towards domestic politics, there are distortions to employment that have occurred in the free trade era and were already occurring before the first round of the big free trade deals in the 90s. Um, so I think that people who are sort of losing their minds over the tariffs do need to stop and ask themselves the question: um, Are you okay with things going on as they have been going on for quite a while? Um, the touchstone for me in the Trump era is the Flight 93 election, which I conveniently have right here. Um, and I
You're
think,
talking about the essay by Michael Anton that he wrote
yes,
anonymously, but later came out that he wrote it. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
after he got fired from BlackRock, there was no reason for it to remain pseudonymous.
I should say at the moment, Michael Anton, he was a deputy national security advisor, I think, or he was thought, and then people kind of thought he might become the national security advisor in the Trump administration. I suspect he has some sort of beef with the actual guy who got that role, Michael Waltz. But Anton does have a prominent and influential position at the State Department, right?
Yeah, he's I think it's called director of strategy. It's the
Yeah.
old George Kennan position. So from that essay, I'll just read quite quickly. The same can be said for Trumpian trade policies and anti globalization instincts. Who cares if productivity numbers tick down or if our already somnambulant GDP sinks a bit further into its pillow? Nearly all the gains of the last 20 years have accrued to the junta anyway. It would, at this point, be better for the nation to divide up more equitably a slightly smaller pie than to add one extra slice, only to ensure that it and 8 of the other 9 go first to the government and its rentiers, and the rest to the same 4 industries and 200 families. Will this work? Ask a pessimist, get a pessimistic answer. So don't ask. Ask instead, is it worth trying? Is it better than the alternative? If you can't say forthrightly yes, you are either part of the junta, a fool, or a conservative intellectual. So I think that for me, that's been the framework of the tariffs. Uh, this is what we can do right now politically. We can talk about better forms of global system rebalancing, things that involve monetary agreements, things that involve targeted subsidies, and so forth. But the fact of the matter is, you know, doing a new international monetary accord would require over a year and requires the cooperation of a lot of countries that are benefiting from the current non-system. The doing a big subsidy package would require getting stuff through Congress, where realistically the GOP has a razor's margin right now. This is what we can do right now. So, do I think it could be done better? Certainly. Uh, do I think that there may be pain resulting from it? Yes. But also, I do think that if you actually believe that there is a problem, um, we are sort of in desperado mode right now. We have to try something, and we are trying something, and I think that that is better than just sort of bopping along with the Bush-Obama consensus.
Yeah, on your point about the kind of strategic dimension of this, about whether we have an economy that's actually capable of projecting power geopolitically, which requires, some sort of defense industrial base. Orrin Cass, who is the chief economist at, I think it's called American Compass, he's become one of the most prominent defenders of tariffs and promoters of tariff policy. And one point that he's made is that our country we can't just only target things of strategic significance and say, well, we're going to have tariffs specifically for like shipbuilding, just for warships. He makes a point that we have to generally retain and strengthen our like manufacturing know-how. We have to have a broad industrial economy if we want to expect to continue making the kinds of things that make America the top dog militarily. And that makes sense to me. Interestingly, he's been kind of critical of the exact way that Trump has pursued tariff policies. He's been arguing that we should keep this 10% global tariff, make it permanent, perhaps even get Congress to pass it so that its permanence becomes more guaranteed. But he's thought that we should kind of lower the reciprocal tariff. So he's probably happy today. Although I think he also thought we should more gradually impose tariffs even on China. So I'm not sure what he'll say about that. Joseph, I imagine you've also been thinking a lot about tariffs lately. What are your thoughts today on Trump's Liberation Day tariffs and then the news that you shared at the beginning of this episode?
Well, my cards on the table, I'm relatively tariff skeptic. I think that industrial policy is necessary, but I am much more in favor of other kinds of government intervention, like targeted subsidies, among a variety of other things that I think are more effective. But I think the real question for the Trump administration, as far as tariffs go, is really the question of what is the purpose of the tariff regime that Trump is imposing? Because there are several different uh, camps, I think, within the administration that are all fighting for tariff policy to be run along their lines. There are those who believe that tariffs should be done as a protectionist measure to promote American industry. There are those who believe that tariffs should be imposed as a way to leverage better trade terms for the United States. And then is also some people who think that tariffs should be used to raise revenue as a kind of a tax measure. And all of those three camps are kind of incompatible, especially the divide between the protectionists and people who believe that tariffs are a negotiating tool is quite sharp. If your goal is to lower trade barriers, then that is the opposite of protectionism. It is leveraging tariff threats in order to achieve freer trade and a more integrated global trade system, which is the exact opposite of the protectionist argument that America should impose more trade barriers in order to implement a greater level of industrialization in that way. So I think that to the extent and it's difficult to see Trump is happy to keep the public in the dark about what his goals are with the tariff implementation, and I believe that he's been keeping the administration and these two camps are still a bit in the dark as to who is going to come out on top ultimately, as this is only a pause, not necessarily a revocation of tariffs. Um, the kinds of trade deals or agreements that Trump is asking for may not be the various countries that are negotiating may not be willing to meet his terms. So in 90 days, we'll have to run this whole thing all over again. Is it going to be enough? How big are the reimposed, renegotiated tariff barriers going to be? Um, so that I think is really the big question. Is this a negotiating attempt in order to get better terms of trade for the United States, or is it general protectionism? Um, the the use of really large tariffs to achieve general protectionism, which is what a lot of people thought was going to happen on Liberation Day. Now there's much more of a question with Trump's pause. Uh, is obviously very much of a shock to the system, and potentially very politically unpopular. Uh, and so there's always an incentive to obfuscate or push that off as much as possible in order to try to prevent a reckoning if necessary. So that's another confounding factor, and I think that's going to be the big question for the economics policy of this administration is ultimately when the cards are down, what's the purpose of the policy?
Yeah. I think I'm going to give you the last word, Jude, but first I want to say, kind of in response to that humorous quote that you read from Anton. It was very serious quote and profound, but also it ended on a kind of humorous note. And maybe I want to kind of ape the sort of conservative intellectual that he had in mind and see what you want to say. And there's lots of different varieties of conservatism. There's like neoconservatism, paleoconservatism, Buchananite conservatism, classical liberalism, which is a kind of conservatism. But I'm thinking now of like a dispositional or temperamental conservatism. One that is based on a kind of gratitude for what we have, and on this general sense that things can spin out of control, like a general impression that things are fragile and need to be preserved. And the reason that this type of conservatism is on my mind right now is because, when Trump announced these tariffs, to me, it just seemed like way too dramatic and risky. Like that was my biggest kind of emotional response. And, I take Anton's point. I take your point that, we don't want to have an economy that's just, at the bottom, like the bottom 80% are just service workers and the top 20% are like doing professional and legal and financial services. Like that's not a robust, fair economy that makes for good community building. I totally get that. But at the same time, like when Trump announced the tariffs, inflation was closer to 2% than 3%. Unemployment was about 4%. The American economy is in many ways like the envy of the world. Like other countries just kind of marvel that we just keep on growing despite our already high level of prosperity. And what Trump did just seemed like such a gamble to me. And we've already seen the stock market has fallen. Financial institutions, economists are predicting a recession. I don't know if you've been looking at the bond markets, but people are like dumping treasuries, which is bad because that raises the cost of borrowing and can create a debt crisis. It can also, in various ways, lead to higher mortgage rates, making it harder for people to buy homes. A recession could cause breadwinners to lose their job or have lower salaries, which worsens the affordability crisis. It really can screw over old people who maybe don't own stocks directly, but they have a lot of exposure to the stock market through their pensions and retirement funds. And I understand the economy needs to change, but it's like people have been acting within the contours of our current economy, and I was worried that a lot of us were going to get a lot of pain because of this super abrupt policy change, that would probably have a bunch of unintended consequences that I didn't even name right now and that are tough to predict, like allies not trusting us anymore, geopolitical things like that, or China getting closer to countries in Southeast Asia that we're trying to sort of peel away from China. So that was why, I'm kind of a level-headed guy. I don't tend to like freak out. I kind of assume that everything's going to be fine, but I was, I think, more worried when I was watching Trump's announcement than I had been in a long time. But how would you respond to that set of concerns, if you want to say anything in response, Jude?
So there are two things I would say that you need to keep in mind. The first off is that the first of them is that we have a very thin margin in Congress right now. We are probably going to lose the midterms. Uh, just based on gamblers' instincts, we are probably headed for a recession no matter what. Uh, there hasn't been a natural correction to the market in about 10 years. The COVID recession was artificial, and we threw a disgusting amount of money at it. And that is why we are dealing with a more inflationary environment to start with. Um, we have to do something now. Trump has to do something now. If you actually believe the priors, uh, we are at the sort of the height of our ability to do something, locally speaking. And so you may as well go big. Um, the and if you don't, second point, you are acceding to a future in which basically the United States starts to look an awful lot like Great Britain, which is to say, a financial capital that is doing quite well, that is surrounded by a deteriorating nation state. Um, for Britain, that can work up to a point because they rely on American defense ultimately. They can just sort of parasite on what we are doing. We cannot do that. A world in which we are just a consumer economy dependent on China for manufacturing uh, just doesn't really work. At a certain point, they can start to put the squeeze on us. Um, I personally do not really relish a future in which we look like the United Kingdom, which is to say, a future in which we look like the Cayman Islands, but with white people. I think that that is bad. I would rather have a nation, even if it is a somewhat poorer nation. So, um, as I said, I think that there are things that are desirable that have not been done. I think that certainly the messaging about this round of tariffs could have been much better. I think that a somewhat longer phase in perhaps would have been desirable, but realistically, we are not dealing with an infinity of time here. We are dealing with a particular political moment. So, and I think that within that political moment, you have to try something, or you can just say, yeah, we're going to sit back and we will be okay if things just sort of keep on trucking as they were, which to me is unacceptable.
I would have one thing to say in response to that. I think that if that were the case, then I don't think it makes much sense to do the 90-day pause. It would have made much more sense to announce this further in advance, you know, 90 more days in advance and allow more time for adjustment. But to go in from the start and then to pull back immediately afterwards and say, okay, now we're going to pause for 90 days, and then in 90 days, who knows what's going to happen. That doesn't strike me as particularly well done, even in the scenario that you named.
Although that seems like that's sort of just a feature of Trump's personality. Even in the art of the deal, he talks about, open negotiations with like a crazy big demand that's going to kind of intimidate your negotiating partner. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think Joseph, me and you are in agreement on that, but it's just kind of how Trump does things, even with Iran negotiations, which we're going to be talking about pretty soon. But I think we do need to move on to Trump's Monday meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. This is the second time in 2 months that Bibi has come to the White House. I think he's the only foreign leader who has already come twice in Trump's second term. This meeting didn't seem to go quite as well for Bibi as the last meeting did. During that previous meeting, Trump announced a plan for the U.S. to take over Gaza and drive out the Palestinians living there, and Netanyahu, of course, liked that. This time, Bibi didn't get much of anything that he wanted. People thought he was visiting to talk mostly about tariffs. Israel had removed its own tariffs on America, and Netanyahu came apparently to request that Trump remove the new tariffs on Israel, but Trump is refusing to do that, or, at least he was during the meeting when he was asked by a journalist. They also talked about Gaza, and Trump on that topic did make some noises that Bibi probably liked. Although he kind of introduced a little ambiguity in whether he still subscribed to this plan of the U.S. taking over Gaza. But he did say we're going to take control of Gaza, possibly even deploy U.S. peacekeepers there, as he said. So Bibi liked that, I'm sure. But after Netanyahu talked about the importance of countering Iran and not letting it get a nuclear weapon, that's the moment when Trump stepped in, made the journalists kind of quiet down so that he could announce direct talks with Iran that he said are going to be scheduled for Saturday. Netanyahu was visibly uncomfortable as Trump spoke, but he just kind of had to nod along. So that was pretty interesting, I thought. And they talked about some other issues. But Jude, what did you take from this meeting with Netanyahu?
I think that I think it was an encouraging meeting. I do not think that Trump is inclined to let the tail wag the dog on American foreign policy any further. Something that was notable was the discussion of Syria. Obviously, in December, rebel forces pushed Bashar al Assad from power. There is a new government at Damascus run by some very unpleasant people who previously had been affiliated with Al Qaeda. The Turks have taken a very active interest. They backed this group to power, more or less. They have their own interests with Kurdish separatists in the northern part of the country. Um, so much of Israel's posturing in the aftermath of Assad's ouster has pertained to Turkey. Um, Turkey is a large, relatively well developed Muslim power that is run by a leader, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who is broadly speaking Islamist. Um, and in the aftermath of that, there has been a lot of movement on the Israeli side to try to counter Turkish interests in Syria, um, which are significant. As reported in this little magazine called The American Conservative, uh, Turkey's security forces are more or less administering the coastal portion of Syria. They are running the country out of the Four Seasons Hotel in Damascus. So Turkey is a NATO ally, which makes it more interesting and complicated for the United States, which has had a preference for Israel in the region. So during the discussion of this, Trump just came out and said, it's going to make a lot of people angry, but I like Erdogan. He's a guy I can deal with. And we are not that interested in undercutting Turkey's interests in Syria. So I think that that's generally good. I think it is good diplomacy to balance offshore powers against each other rather than picking winners and losers and backing them to the hilt. Um, I think that Turkey, as a large Sunni power, is a natural counterbalance to Iran. So I think that the part of what's going on is trying to configure the region so that we can deal with Iran separately and get a decent deal out of them. Shortly before this, there's a lot of breaking news today, but shortly before we started recording, the president of Iran, Pezeshkian, said that the supreme leader has no problems with American investment in Iran and further economic engagement in Iran. So I think that if the goal that you're looking for is stability in the Middle East, and subsequently less direct American involvement in the Middle East. This was a very encouraging week for that. Um, if you are in the Israel boosting business, you might be somewhat frustrated, but it's not clear to me that, you know, I always like to talk about just sort of the numerical issues in the Middle East, right? Israel is a nation of about 10 million, and it definitely punches well above its weight with hard power and has a much closer diplomatic relation with the West than most of the other powers in the area. But it is 10 million people at the end of the day. You can't project, you can't force down a particular order on an area that has players like Turkey, which is 85 million, Iran, which is 90 million, Egypt, which is 120 million, uh, and Saudi Arabia, which is 40 million. Um, that's just not viable. That is, arithmetic is against you. So I think Israel and Israeli politicians are going to find that there is a deal to be made. They can certainly maintain relative Israeli primacy in the area with American support, but they are going to have to play ball. They are going to have to work towards a more durable arrangement or configuration in the Middle East.
Joseph, your thoughts?
Well, I am not a super Middle East guy personally. But yeah, I pretty much agree with what Jude said. I think there's definitely been a lot of resurgence of Turkish influence in the Middle East in the recent past, and I think that that's really a very good thing for the United States. Turkey is certainly much more of a uh, sort of stabilizing force than we've often seen in the Middle East. And I think that if we could return to, you know, neo-Ottomanism is probably rather overstated. I don't think that Erdogan is gonna take back over and restart the caliphate. Um, but I do think that a much more influential Turkey in the Middle East would be significantly better for U.S. prospects as far as being able to not pay attention to the Middle East. Because Erdogan and Turkey have relatively close relationships already with the West, and their interest is not in fractionalism.
Yeah, I'll say in response to what you said, Jude, it's what you described seems like the kind of thing that the U.S. can do that Israel doesn't want the U.S. to do, but that is ultimately good for Israeli interests. Like just kind of laying down the law and saying, no, you're not going to be challenging Turkey and Syria. Like you've got enough on your plate with Hezbollah in Lebanon and with the Houthis and with Gaza and the West Bank. I'm not saying I support Israel having all that stuff on its plate. But I'm just making the point that, and it's kind of your point too, Jude, that maybe they've taken on too big of a geopolitical challenge for themselves in trying to rid the region of any possible threat or instability. And oftentimes it's counterproductive.
Well, and
But I'll just go ahead.
this is this is a case where I wish I had a better handle on Israeli internal politics. Um, it is not clear to me how much of Israeli foreign policy right now is sort of involved with the particular political prospects of Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu, in certain respects, is a relative moderate in the Israeli political spectrum, but it's not clear to me that a more hardline figure like Naftali Bennett, who is less swashbuckling, has fewer political pressures at home, would be pursuing the same kind of maximalist foreign policy.
Yeah, I mean, Netanyahu is dependent for his political survival on the continued support of the most right-wing members of the Israeli government. Basically, like these settlers, the most prominent one has probably Ben Gvir. So that's definitely something worth mentioning. One thing that I'll add about this meeting between Trump and Netanyahu that stood out to me. I'm quite interested in how Trump has turned these Oval Office meetings with foreign leaders into a chance to just kind of hold court. And it's kind of interesting, the Oval Office is much more golden than it used to be, in terms of the little touches that Trump has put on, in terms of interior decoration.
And we're just getting started.
Yeah, it seems like it's only getting more and more gold. Um, so, it's obviously not unusual for a president to, in front of reporters, talk to a foreign leader in the Oval Office. That's totally standard. But it is quite unusual just how long these meetings are and how many questions Trump is taking from reporters and how kind of dynamic and unscripted these Oval Office meetings are. And in the case of Zelensky, the most infamous example of these Trump 2.0 Oval Office meetings, I thought it, I thought it was a bad thing that Trump was doing this. I thought he and Vance were right to kind of put Zelensky in his place because Zelensky was challenging them, undermining administration policy. But it seemed like an example where having these long, unpredictable Oval Office meetings was a bad idea because there's just not much that Zelensky and Trump can say that's not in that moment going to piss off the other person. So it might be better to have a more scripted thing where you answer maybe one reporter's question and then you go away from the Oval Office, behind closed doors, and then you argue. But in this case with Netanyahu, I liked this dynamic, um, because it really had the effect of reducing Netanyahu to the role of a spectator. Because with all these Liberation Day tariffs, of course, all of the questions from reporters were directed at Trump. And so, as I said, he was just kind of holding court as Netanyahu sat there and watched. And I think that that's actually healthy for the U.S. Israel relationship right now because Netanyahu seems to frequently forget that Israel is the client in this relationship. And on this occasion, he definitely did look like the
Say the
client.
quote, Andrew. Say the quote.
What? I don't know the quote. What is the quote?
Bill Clinton in the 90s, after meeting with Netanyahu, says, "Who's the fucking superpower here?"
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I had forgotten that, but I had read that before. Yeah, every president seemingly, and that I think that was responding. That was after a meeting with Netanyahu specifically, right?
Yes.
Or so that's interesting. Like a lot of a sequence of presidents have been annoyed by Netanyahu, and Trump is definitely no exception. Although their friendship slash it's kind of like a frenemy relationship, I guess. But Trump even during this meeting, when he was asked about the tariffs, and he held firm and said, "No, we're still going to keep tariffs on Israel." And he pointed out that we give billions of dollars a year of it to Israel. He turned to Netanyahu at that moment and said something like, "Congratulations for that, by the way." This is even though Trump has been less critical of Israeli actions in Gaza. This what he's doing strikes me as being very different from the Biden bear hug. That was the Biden administration's strategy, and it didn't work. Trump has more of this kind of alpha male persona, obviously, and he doesn't seem to moderate that in the presence of Netanyahu. A lot of people are making a point about how he always helps Netanyahu with this chair, but I think that's kind of marginal. Like that that's sort of missing the point if that's all that you focus on. Um, he is kind of willing to put Netanyahu in his place, um, and I think that hasn't really shown up in terms of policy with regard to Gaza. Trump was able to get Netanyahu to agree to a ceasefire, but then Trump also acquiesced when Netanyahu and Israel violated the ceasefire, and then the U.S. has been helping Israel out in terms of targeting the Houthis in Yemen. But I think that this willingness on Trump's part to stand up to Netanyahu can be very useful in the case of Iran because Netanyahu has been pushing for a U.S. Iran war for decades, literally. And right now, Trump wants to avoid that. And that might be a good segue for us to move on to our last topic, which we've already kind of touched on, which is Iran, specifically the U.S. talks with Iran that Trump announced will take place on Saturday. A kind of odd ambiguity has arisen since Trump made that announcement. He specified that the talks would be direct talks with Iran at a very high level. Iran's foreign minister later confirmed that there would be talks, but said on Twitter and in the Washington Post that the talks would be indirect, meaning they would take place through mediators rather than through face-to-face negotiations. I'm inclined to think that Trump is telling the truth on that for reasons that I can explain. But Joseph, what do you want to say about these possible or these U.S. Iran talks that are scheduled for Saturday?
Yeah, I mean, the again, there's a big question about what the administration's policy towards the Iran talks is going to be. There's also two camps here. One headed up by Waltz that wants a complete dismemberment of the Iranian uh, civilian nuclear program, and this is what Netanyahu is in support of, the Libya option, which, if I were going to try to sell that, I would never mention Libya, because I don't know why anybody would want to end up the way Gaddafi did.
In a
And then there's
ditch.
also,
Yeah. Mm.
and then there's also, yeah, essentially the Obama era JCPOA approach, which is just putting limits on the enrichment programs.
And
So
putting a verification system to make sure we can be assured that they're not exceeding those limits. Yeah.
exactly. And so the question is which one of those is going to run the day, because so far there hasn't been much indication of which one ultimately the president is in favor of.
Right. Jude, what do you think?
I tend to think that when the president of the United States, the leader of the free world, the indispensable superpower, says you're having direct talks, you're having direct talks. I don't think that you get to argue about it. I think that there are phone calls that you don't get to say no to. I think that we're looking for a deal. I think it's sort of as simple as that. We have massed a large portion of our air assets at Diego Garcia, notionally with the intention of hitting the Houthis, but really, reading between the lines to menace Iran a bit. You don't really need a third of all American air assets at Diego Garcia if you're just, bombing Sana again. So I think that Trump is going to try to do JCPOA, but better. I think that appeals to him, both as somebody who's not necessarily inherently interested in American involvement in this part of the world, but also as somebody who is interested in doing Obama one better, which has been a fairly consistent personal style of his. I'm encouraged. I think that I wouldn't put money on it necessarily, but I think that the chances of us doing a direct military invention in Iran are lower right now than they have been for a while. I think that this fits with what we were talking about with the sort of emerging configuration in the region as seen in the politicking over Syria. I think, you know, nobody thinks that Iran is a great place. Nobody really thinks that it's a place they want to live, excepting perhaps Jackson Hinkle. But they are rational actors. I do think that they are sensible to a deal. Otherwise, we would not have done deals with them in the past. They would not have acquiesced to deals in the past. Is a somewhat distinct case from North Korea, which neoconservative leaning commentators often compare it to. Iran, while it is, a pariah power in the West, is integrated into global markets, at least indirectly, through Central Asia. It is not a garrison state the way that North Korea is. While you wouldn't call it a free society, the Iranian government is in fact responsive to domestic pressures in a way that North Korea is not. So I think that there's a deal to be made here, as long as you can sort of get over the ick factor of dealing with the Ayatollahs.
Yeah, I agree. They are a rational actor. They're even quite risk averse. If you follow their behavior closely, they do fund these, this proxy network, which is kind of, severely degraded right now, I should say. But they do that for kind of normal military reasons. Like we have allies, they have allies. They use it as a way to project power abroad. And they do have Republican institutions. This Masoud Pezeshkian guy, their current president, he became president through elections, seemingly fair and free elections. There's some limits that are imposed on who can run, but he wasn't the preferred candidate of the Ayatollah, as I understand. He became president because their previous president was a real hardliner named Raisi, and he died in a odd helicopter crash. Pezeshkian has been signaling that he wants to negotiate with the West. He ran on a platform of negotiating with the U.S. led West, and hardliners in Iran were really opposed to that. One thing that's good about negotiating with Iran right now is it can vindicate the reformists, especially Pezeshkian, and sideline the hardliners rather than doing the opposite, because the hardliners are very skeptical that Trump, who withdrew from the previous Iran nuclear deal, will actually secure a new one and abide by it. Iran was in compliance with the deal, as even the Trump administration admitted when Trump withdrew from it. As far as the direct talks, indirect talks thing, I don't know how much it matters. I guess it does matter because direct talks mean we're moving faster toward a deal. But the reason I think that Trump is the one telling the truth is because during the Obama administration, when negotiations got started, Ayatollah Khamenei had claimed to have banned negotiations with the U.S. when secretly he was dispatching envoys to meet with U.S. officials, I believe in Oman, which is where they're going to be meeting on Saturday. So he has a track record of doing that, perhaps for domestic political reasons. He doesn't want to look weak. I'm refusing to talk with the president. That makes him look kind of strong, even though he's secretly allowing his envoys to meet directly. And then also, I'm pretty sure their foreign minister and one of their top envoys, who is their former UN ambassador, is going to be going to Oman for the talks. And I don't really see why they would do that if they weren't meeting face to face with their U.S. officials. We should say that Special Envoy Steve Witkoff is the U.S. representative who's going to be leading the negotiations. In some ways, that is encouraging. I'd rather he be there than Rubio or Waltz leading this because they're longtime Iran hawks, although Rubio seems willing to be a team player so far in the second Trump administration. On the other hand, this is probably an unusually technical negotiation because it has to do with all sorts of complex nuclear issues and with a very fraught bilateral history between the U.S. and Iran. It really requires a specialist. Iran's going to send their best envoys, so I think Witkoff might be a little, unprepared for this. I think someone was cutting out a little bit. Did someone want to say something?
That was me. Because of the abject condition of Wi-Fi at the American Conservatives bunker. Please donate and subscribe so that we can get some good Wi-Fi in here. I would say that I have a fairly low opinion of American professional diplomats who seem to specialize in getting rolled. Um, I think that the sort of I think that if diplomacy is focused entirely on the small ball technical aspects that you're referring to, we are unlikely to have a more durable order in the area. Um, I think that Witkoff going is encouraging. I think that he's the man who told Netanyahu's people, I don't care that it's Sabbath. You are going to meet with me right now. We are going to get this done while negotiating over Gaza. Um, so I am sure that the usual crowd of, bean counters and ceremonial experts will follow Witkoff to sort the technical details. But I'd much rather have him in there than some lifelong apparatchik who graduated from, Georgetown's School of International Relations and did all the right things to get into the place where he can get rolled by the Ayatollahs.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, Woodcock, he seems awfully busy right now. He's like handling the Russia-Ukraine war, the Israel-Gaza war, and now the Iran nuclear thing. But obviously, Trump trusts him, and he does seem like an impressive and intelligent person. Joseph, you want to add any last word before we move on to picks of the week? And if you don't, you can go ahead and start with your pick of the week.
Well, I'll just say if Witkoff can pull off even one, he'll be one of the greatest negotiators the U.S. has ever had. So,
um, Go ahead, Joseph. Pick of the week.
sure. For my pick of the week, I will go ahead and recommend Spencer's fantastic essay. This is not actually this is not particularly political. But Spencer Neal wrote a great essay called "Steak and Company," a meditation on uh sort of the Virginia home life. So I would highly recommend that. It's a fantastic essay, and Spencer writes some great stuff. So go check it out.
Jude.
I will go with the weekly column of Jim Antle, formerly editor in chief of the American Conservative, Trump the Gambler, which is talking about tariffs, talking about the fact that Trump is spending political capital now rather than building it, and what that means. It touches on a few of the things that we talked about during our discussion of tariffs, uh, and whether the pain is sort of politically prohibitive and what the actual goal here is. So, Jim Antle, Trump the Gambler.
And I'm going to pick Eric Gartsky's essay, Predator or Prey? It's the wrong question for great powers. Gartsky, I don't know how well known he is generally, but in political science, like academic political science, he's thought of as, a very eminent and respected voice whose articles are in international relations syllabi. I thought it was an interesting article. He kind of talks about how in our international system sometimes exercising power is more subtle than just trying to dominate another state, and he sort of applies the reasoning to uh, the Trump administration, offering advice on how to proceed forward as the liberal international order seemingly undergoes profound shifts. So, Predator or Prey by Eric Gartsky. And that's it for this episode of Tech Right Now. I want to thank our listeners for listening up to this point, and I want to thank you, Jude, and you, Joseph, for the enjoyable and illuminating conversation.